I spent 10 years building this aviation empire from a pile of debt into a billion-dollar titan. But today, the heir fired me to replace me with his girlfriend, who thinks aerodynamics is a filter setting. He expects me to beg. Instead, I am walking away with the proprietary codes that keep his planes flying. Let us see how far he gets when the entire fleet refuses to take off. My name is Elena Vance. I stood alone in the main conference room on the 42nd floor of the Thorn Aerospace Tower in Seattle. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, the gray sky wept. A relentless, driving rain battered the windows, distorting the city lights below into smeared streaks of neon. I am 34 years old, and for the first time in a decade, I felt completely untethered. I placed my hand on the cold mahogany table. I could almost feel the ghost of Thomas Thorne sitting at the head of it. 10 years ago, this company was nothing but a rust bucket drowning in $80 million of debt. Thomas had the vision, but he did not have the structure. I gave him that. I gave him 10 years of 16-hour days. I sacrificed my 20s to turn his failing workshop into a premier aviation empire worth $3 billion. When Thomas died last month, I thought I was preserving his legacy. I was wrong. The heavy oak doors swung open. Julian Thorne walked in, bringing the scent of expensive cologne and entitlement with him. He was 30 years old and had never tightened a bolt in his life. Clinging to his arm was Sienna Croft. I knew her only from the tabloids and her Instagram feed. She wore a dress that cost more than my first car and looked entirely out of place in a room where military defense contracts were negotiated. Julian did not sit down. He tossed a thin manila folder onto the polished wood. It slid across the surface and stopped inches from my hand. "We are making changes, Elena," Julian said, refusing to meet my eyes. "Effective immediately. You are being let go. It is just a restructuring of our brand vision." I looked at the folder, then at him. I did not blink. The silence stretched until Sienna broke it with a sharp, high-pitched laugh. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering with disdain on my charcoal blazer and sensible heels. "Oh, Julian, she is just so drab," Sienna said, leaning against the table. "I mean, look at her. We are an aerospace company, not a funeral home. I will be taking over as the new creative director and chief operating officer. We need to pivot. We need youth. We need energy." She had no degree. She had no experience. She thought aerodynamics was a buzzword. Julian cleared his throat and slid a check across the table. It was a cashier's check for $50,000. It was an insult. "This is for your time," Julian said, his voice hardening. "Consider it a severance gift. But before you leave the premises, I need you to hand over the administrative keys and the full source code for the Vance Nav positioning system. The Vance Nav system, my design, the proprietary algorithm that allowed our cargo planes to navigate polar routes with zero latency. It was the only thing keeping the company profitable." I looked at the check. I did not touch it. I did not scream. I did not beg. I simply turned and walked to the small credenza where I kept my personal items. I opened a small cardboard box and placed a framed photograph of my mother inside. "I do not want your money, Julian," I said, my voice steady. "You take the money and you give me the codes," Julian snapped, stepping forward. "Or I will make sure you never work in this industry again. I will bury you so deep. No airline will hire you to sweep their hangars." I placed a small ceramic cactus into the box. That was everything. 10 years of life reduced to 2 items. I picked up the box and walked toward the door. "The codes are in the server." I lied. I walked out of the conference room and toward the elevators. The open plan office was silent. Dozens of engineers, people I had hired and trained, watched me with wide eyes. As I reached the glass doors of the lobby, the head of security stepped in front of me. He looked pained. "I am sorry, Ms. Vance," he muttered, looking at the floor. "Mr. Thorne called down. He said He said I have to search your box. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, the only sign of the fury burning in my gut. I set the box down. He rifled through it, moving the picture frame, checking under the cactus pot, treating me like a thief in front of the empire I built. "It is clear," he said softly. I picked up my box and stepped into the elevator. As the doors began to slide shut, I saw Julian and Sienna standing at the far end of the hall, watching me. Sienna was smiling. The metal doors met, cutting off their view. The mask of professional detachment slipped from my face. My expression shifted from pain to something arctic. I looked at my reflection in the polished steel of the elevator door. Good luck trying to start the engines. "Without me," I whispered. 3 months had passed since the elevator doors closed on my career. I sat on the edge of a sagging mattress in a studio apartment that was smaller than my old walk-in closet. The air smelled of stale coffee and damp drywall. My bank accounts were frozen. Julian had filed a lawsuit the day after I left, accusing me of data sabotage and corporate espionage. It was a lie, of course, but lawyers cost money, and Julian had billions of it while I currently had $40 in my wallet. I had tried to find work. I sent resumes to Delta, United, and even the regional cargo carriers. The response was always the same: a polite silence or a terse rejection email. Julian had been busy. He had branded me as toxic, a disgruntled employee who stole intellectual property. In the tight-knit world of aviation executives, his word was poison. So, I traded my tailored suits for grease-stained coveralls. I found work at a small private airfield 20 miles outside the city limits. It was a dusty shed where hobbyists brought their single-engine Cessnas for oil changes. I spent my days replacing spark plugs and patching fuel lines for $15 an hour. It was humiliating work for someone who used to design military-grade navigation systems. But the hum of an engine was the only thing that kept me sane. In the corner of the shop, an old television set was always tuned to the business news. It was torture, but I could not look away. The anchor was discussing Thorn Aerospace. The screen flashed the new logo Sienna had commissioned. It was bright pink and gold, looking more like a fashion label than a defense contractor. "Thorn Aerospace announces another round of layoffs today," the reporter said. "Sources say 20 senior engineers have been let go as the company pivots toward a younger, more dynamic image." My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a burner phone I had bought with cash. I checked the message. It was from Marcus, one of the few lead engineers Julian had not fired yet. "It is a disaster. Elena," the text read, "the Phoenix X keeps failing the wind tunnel tests. The balance system is shot. Sienna cut the budget for the gyroscope stabilizers to pay for the launch party in Milan. We are flying blind." I stared at the screen. The Phoenix X was the contract that Thomas had bet the company on. It was a fighter jet prototype for the Department of Defense. If they missed the delivery deadline, the penalties would bankrupt them. Later that evening, a process server knocked on my door. He handed me a thick envelope and left without a word. It was a court summons. Julian's lawyers were not just suing for damages anymore. They were threatening criminal charges. They demanded I return to the headquarters and unlock the Vance Nav legacy data immediately. Or they would press for a 5-year prison sentence for theft of critical infrastructure. I sat at my rickety kitchen table and read the letter. Most people would have been terrified. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. Julian was desperate. He realized that firing me was like removing the brain from a body and expecting it to run a marathon. He needed me. I picked up the phone and dialed the number on the letterhead. "This is Elena Vance," I said when the lawyer answered. "Tell Julian I will come in." The next morning, I sat across from Julian in a coffee shop near the office. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his hand shook slightly as he held his cup. "You will unlock the system," Julian said, his voice lacking its usual arrogance. "And you will teach the new team how to maintain it. If you do this, I will drop the lawsuit. I am not coming back as an employee," I said. sipping my water. I will come back as a temporary technical advisor, minimum wage, no benefits, just access. He looked at me with suspicion. Why? Because I need to eat, Julian, and I do not want to go to jail. I lied, keeping my voice low. I am beaten. You win. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. He thought he had broken me. He thought I was desperate for scraps. Fine. He said, report to Sienna tomorrow. Do not make me regret this. I watched him leave. He had no idea. He was inviting the virus right back into the mainframe. Walking back into the lobby of Thorn Aerospace felt like stepping into a mausoleum that had been repainted by a clown. The sleek, minimalist aesthetic my team and I had curated to impress military generals was gone. In its place were neon signs and oversized prints of Sienna's face. I took the elevator up to the executive floor, my former corner office. The nerve center where I had spent thousands of hours negotiating contracts was unrecognizable. The glass walls were lined with shelves displaying luxury handbags. Photographic lights and backdrops cluttered the space where my drafting table used to be. Julian met me in the hallway. He did not offer a handshake. He shoved a thick stack of papers into my chest. Standard non-disclosure agreement, Julian said, his voice clipped. And an employment contract. You answer directly to Sienna. You do not speak to the senior engineers unless spoken to. And this is your desk. He pointed to a flimsy folding table set up in the corridor, squeezed directly next to the door of the men's restroom. The chemical smell of industrial air freshener was overwhelming. I understand, I said, keeping my voice devoid of emotion. Sienna emerged from her new studio. She was holding a half-empty latte and looking at her phone. She glanced up at me, a smirk spreading across her face. Oh, good. You are here, Sienna said, thrusting the cold cup at me. This is stale. Go get me another one. Soy milk, 2 pumps of vanilla. And after that, I need you to organize my live stream schedule for the week. I am doing a Day in the Life of a Girl Boss's segment for my followers. I thought I was here to assist with the navigation codes, I said, keeping my head down. You are here because we allow you to be here. Sienna snapped. Now go get the coffee. I took the cup. I walked to the break room, forcing my shoulders to slump, playing the part of the defeated ex-employee perfectly. While the coffee machine hissed, I heard Julian's voice coming from the executive suite next door. The door was slightly ajar. I need another month, Julian was saying into his phone, his tone frantic. I cannot pay the interest yet. You cannot foreclose on the tower. My father built this place. Just give me until the Phoenix launch. I stared at the dark liquid filling the cup. He had mortgaged the headquarters. He was drowning in debt and gambling everything on a plane that could not fly. When the lunch hour arrived, the floor emptied. I did not go to the cafeteria. I walked over to the desk of a junior intern who I knew had a habit of leaving his terminal unlocked. I sat down and typed furiously, accessing the procurement logs for the Phoenix X project. My eyes scanned the digital invoices, and my blood ran cold. Sienna had fired our longtime German titanium supplier. Instead, she had authorized the purchase of 3 tons of fuselage alloy from a company called Gilded Shell LLC based in the Cayman Islands. The price was listed as market rate, but the material specifications were for a lower-grade aluminum blend, not aerospace-grade titanium. She was swapping the materials and pocketing the difference. She was building a supersonic jet out of cheap metal that would shear apart at Mach 1. Suddenly, a shout rang out from the assembly floor below the atrium. The hydraulic clamp is slipping, someone screamed. I ran to the balcony railing. Below, a massive carbon fiber wing was teetering dangerously as a clamp failed. The technicians were freezing in panic, unsure of what to do. Hit the manual override on the secondary valve, I yelled, my voice echoing through the cavernous space. Release the pressure now, or the spar will snap. A technician obeyed instantly. The clamp released, and the wing settled safely onto the support cradle. Silence filled the room. "Who told you to speak?" Sienna's voice cut through the air. She marched up the stairs, her face red with anger. "You are a consultant, not a floor manager. You could have ruined the calibration with your shouting." Julian stepped up beside her. He looked down at the saved wing, then at me. He knew I had just saved them $1 million in damage, but his ego was too fragile to admit it. "She is right, Elena," Julian said, smoothing his tie. "Stay in your lane. We do not need your outdated methods confusing the staff. Go back to your table." I nodded, lowering my head to hide the spark in my eyes. "I am sorry, Julian," I whispered. I waited until 8 o'clock that night. The office was deserted. I logged into the main server using the guest credentials they gave me. I did not fix the navigation glitch. I did not patch the hole in their security. Instead, I opened the quality control subroutine. I typed in a string of code that would log every single keystroke, every approval, and every rejected safety warning directly to a hidden cloud server. I was not here to save the ship. I was here to record the shipwreck. The glowing monitor in the server room illuminated the final piece of the puzzle regarding their incompetence. I was scrolling through the maintenance logs for our commercial fleet when I saw it. There were authorizations for postponing critical engine overhauls on 3 Boeing 747s. The digital approval was dated 3 days ago. The signature at the bottom read, "Elena Vance." My blood ran cold. They were not just firing me. They were forging my signature on safety violations to ensure that if a plane went down, the investigation would lead directly to my prison cell. I needed eyes that I did not have. I found Marcus, the head of IT, hiding in the server farm, eating a sandwich in the dark. He jumped when he saw me. He looked exhausted, his shirt untucked, eyes bloodshot. "They are going to fire me." "Elena," Marcus whispered, his voice shaking. "Julian told me this morning. He said it is a cost center, not a profit center. I have a mortgage. I have 2 kids. I placed a hand on his shoulder. "I can help you, Marcus, but I need you to do something dangerous. I need access to the security archives, specifically the loading dock cameras from last Tuesday." Marcus looked at me, sweat beading on his forehead. He tapped a few keys on his terminal. "If they catch me, they won't," I said. 10 minutes later, we were watching a grainy black and white video feed. A black sedan pulled up to the rear delivery bay. Sienna stepped out, checking her surroundings. A man in a trench coat handed her a heavy metallic briefcase. She opened it just enough for the camera to catch the stacks of cash inside. "That is the supplier from Gilded Shell." Marcus breathed. "She is taking a kickback. She is buying trash metal and pocketing the difference." I had the evidence of fraud. Now I needed to break them publicly. The next morning, Julian organized an emergency press conference to calm the jittery shareholders. He refused to let me sit in the audience. Instead, he forced me to stand behind the velvet curtain, holding up large white cue cards for Sienna, who was too lazy to memorize her speech. The lights were blinding. Sienna stood at the podium, smiling that plastic smile. She looked at the card I held up. The Phoenix X utilizes a retroactive drag coefficient to increase maximum velocity. Sienna read aloud, sounding confident. A murmur went through the crowd of aviation experts and journalists. Retroactive drag coefficient was not a term. It was gibberish. It was a physical impossibility. I saw the head of the physics department from MIT lean over to his colleague and shake his head. Sienna had no idea what she was saying, and I had let her say it. When the cameras turned off, Julian dragged me into the narrow hallway behind the stage. His face was purple. "You wrote that card wrong," he hissed, spitting the words at me. "You made her look like an idiot out there. I just wrote what she told me to write." I stammered, looking down. Julian did not listen. His hand lashed out, striking me hard across the face. The sound was like a whip crack. My head snapped to the side, my cheek burning with sudden, sharp heat. I touched my face, tasting copper in my mouth. "Get out of my sight," Julian growled. "Go fix the engine data." I walked away, clutching my cheek. Tears pricked my eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. That slap was the seal on his death warrant. I was done playing the victim. I was going to send them to federal prison. I waited until midnight. I took the service elevator down to the sub-basement, a place Julian never visited because it smelled of dust and old paper. I found the physical archives. I pulled out the heavy drawer labeled Thorne Thomas Estate. I flipped through the yellowing pages of the original will. Julian had only read the summary. He had been too arrogant to read the addendums. I found it on the last page, a clause Thomas and I had added 5 years ago when the Phoenix project was just a sketch. The intellectual property rights, including all schematics and propulsion theories regarding the Phoenix X engine, are hereby transferred to the Vance Trust, solely administered by Elena Vance. I traced the signature with my finger. Julian did not own the engine. He did not own the blueprints. He was building a billion-dollar jet using stolen property, and the owner was the woman he just slapped. The Sunday morning fog clung to the cemetery grass as I stood before the gray granite headstone. Thomas Thorne, the man who had been a second father to me. I traced the letters of his name with a gloved hand. I remembered the day he hired me, a 24-year-old engineer with too much ambition and no funding. I had promised him on his deathbed that I would keep his legacy flying, that I would never let his company fall. Standing there, I felt a wave of nausea. I had failed him. I had let a parasite take over the host. But my rage was not just about a dead billionaire. It was about the empty bedroom in my small apartment. When Julian fired me, he did not just cut my salary. He maliciously canceled my executive health insurance package effective immediately, retroactive to the start of the billing cycle. My mother, who had been battling stage 4 cancer, was kicked out of her treatment program the very next day. She spent her final weeks in agony because we could not afford the pain management medication. She died 1 month ago, holding my hand, her face twisted in suffering that Julian could have eased with a signature. This was not business anymore. This was a blood debt. I drove back to the city, checking my rearview mirror. A gray sedan had been 2 cars behind me for the last 3 miles. Sienna was paranoid. She had hired a private investigator. I decided to give him a show. Instead of driving to my secret meeting with Marcus, I drove to a rundown public library in the suburbs. I spent 2 hours reading romance novels near the window where he could see me. When I left, I looked the part of a broken, aimless woman with nothing to hide. The next morning, Julian summoned me to his office. He slammed a document onto the desk. It was the safety certification for the upcoming test flight of the Phoenix X. "Sign it," Julian ordered, his voice tight. "The inspectors are coming in 3 days. We need the internal sign-off completed today to file the flight plan." I picked up the paper. The data was falsified. If I signed this, and the plane crashed, I would be the one going to prison for negligence. I let my hand tremble visibly. I widened my eyes, feigning terror. "Julian? I cannot." I stammered, shrinking back into my chair. "The struts. They have not been stress tested." "Sign the damn paper," Elena Julian shouted, slamming his fist on the desk. "Or I call the police and tell them you stole the navigation drives. Do you want to go to jail today?" I pulled a pen from my pocket. It looked like a standard black ballpoint, but it was filled with ink that oxidizes and vanishes completely after 48 hours of exposure to air. Okay, please," I whispered. "I will sign." I scribbled my name on the dotted line. By the time the federal investigators looked at this file after the crash, the signature line would be blank. As I stood up, the door opened. Sienna walked in, carrying a muddy pair of designer boots. She looked at me, then at the boots, and smiled. It was a cruel, ugly expression. "Oh, good. The help is here." Sienna said. I stepped in a puddle outside. Clean these for me. Now. She dropped the muddy boots on the plush carpet. Julian watched, saying nothing. He wanted to see me broken. Sienna, I am here for technical advising. I started. You are here because we own you. Sienna interrupted, stepping close to me, clean. The boots, slowly. I lowered myself to my knees. I took a napkin from the coffee table and began to wipe the mud from the leather. Sienna laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Look at her. Julian? She giggled. The great Elena Vance. She knows her place now. I kept my head down, scrubbing the leather, but as I looked at the polished marble floor, I saw my reflection. My eyes were not wet with tears. They were dry, hard, and burning with a cold fire. Every second of this humiliation was fuel. Every laugh was another nail in their coffins. Later that afternoon, Marcus intercepted me in the hallway near the restrooms. He looked pale. Elena, he whispered, pretending to look at a vending machine. The brake pads. They are made of the wrong composite. If the Phoenix lands at anything over 150 knots, the friction will shatter the discs. The wheels will lock up. It will be a fireball. Does Julian know I asked? I told him. Marcus replied, his voice cracking. He said to ignore it. He said we cannot afford a delay to source new parts. He said, just tell the pilot to use the reverse thrusters early. I nodded slowly. Julian was not just a thief anymore. He was willing to kill. The launch gala for the Phoenix X was held in the Crystal Ballroom of the Fairmont, a 5-star venue that smelled of lilies and old money. Under the crystal chandeliers, the aviation elite gathered, sipping champagne that cost $300 a bottle. Julian had explicitly banned me from the guest list, ensuring security had my photo. However, he had forgotten one crucial detail. The gala was co-hosted by the primary engine supplier, a shell company I had quietly incorporated 5 years ago. I walked past the security checkpoint not as Elena Vance, the fired CEO, but as the guest of honor for Vectra Propulsion. I wore a midnight blue velvet gown that draped over my frame like liquid armor, stark and elegant. Across the room, Sienna looked like a disco ball that had exploded. She was wearing a gold sequined dress with feathers that shed every time she moved. As I descended the staircase, the room shifted. The silence rippled outward from the entrance until the only sound was the clinking of silverware. Julian froze mid-laugh. He was holding court with a group of investors, but as soon as they saw me, they turned their backs on him. General Holloway, the head of procurement for the Air Force, walked right past Julian to shake my hand. Elena, the general said warmly, I was told you were on sabbatical. We were worried about the navigation specs without your eyes on them. Just a short break, General. I smiled, my voice smooth. I wanted to ensure the engine integration was flawless. Julian watched from the periphery, his face flushing a deep, ugly red. He was the host, but I was the center of gravity. Sienna noticed the attention shifting. She downed her glass of wine and signaled a waiter for another, her eyes narrowing on my dress. She marched over, feigning a stumble as she reached me. Oops, she squealed. A glass of dark Cabernet splashed across the front of my gown. The crowd gasped. Sienna covered her mouth with a manicured hand, her eyes gleaming with malice. Oh my God, Elena, I am so clumsy. I guess that dress is ruined. It is probably for the best. It looked a bit outdated anyway. I did not flinch. I did not grab a napkin. I simply looked at the stain, then up at her. It is just a stain. Sienna, I said, my voice projecting clearly enough for the surrounding circle to hear. It can be cleaned. Unlike the aerodynamic profile of the Phoenix. You insisted on adding those aesthetic canards to the nose cone because you thought they looked fierce. Do you realize you have increased the drag coefficient by 12%? The plane will not just be slow, it will be unstable in a crosswind. But I suppose you were too busy picking out feathers to read the physics report, the investors murmured. Sienna's smile faltered. She looked around, realizing people were laughing at her. Not me. 10 minutes later, I went to the ladies' room to dry the stain. The heavy door swung shut behind me, and the lock clicked. Sienna stood there, her face twisted into a snarl. The bubbly influencer mask was gone. You think you are so smart, Sienna hissed, stepping forward until she was inches from my face. If you do not disappear, if you do not stop embarrassing me, I will tell everyone you sold state secrets to the Chinese. I will plant the evidence myself. I leaned against the marble sink, casually sliding my hand into my clutch purse where my phone was recording. You cannot plant evidence if the FAA investigates the books. Sienna, I said, goading her. They will find the fake invoices. They will see the safety inspector was paid off. That inspector is in my pocket, Sienna screamed, her voice echoing off the tiles. I bought him a condo in Miami. He will never talk. And Julian. Julian does whatever I say. You are nobody. You are just a fired employee in a dirty dress. The door burst open. Julian rushed in, looking panicked. He grabbed Sienna by the arm. Shut up, he shouted at her. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. He realized he had lost control of the monster he brought into the company. We are leaving. He dragged her out. I waited a moment, then stopped the recording. I left the party 10 minutes later. On my way out, I stopped by the table where the director of the Federal Aviation Administration was sitting. I placed a thick, plain manila envelope next to his plate. Inside was the raw data of the titanium density tests and a transcript of the safety violations. You dropped this, I whispered to him. I walked out into the cool night air. The party was just getting started, but the funeral had already begun. The clock was ticking down. There were exactly 24 hours left until the Phoenix X was scheduled to taxi onto the runway with 6 billionaire investors and 2 senators on board. The atmosphere at the airfield was electric, but for me, it was the quiet tension of a trap snapping shut. The director of the Federal Aviation Administration had not ignored my envelope. At 4 o'clock in the morning, a convoy of unmarked black SUVs had silently rolled onto the perimeter of the airfield, parking behind the fuel depots. The special inspection team was lying in wait, ready to witness a felony in progress. High above the tarmac in the executive suite, Julian and Sienna were celebrating a victory they had not yet won. Through the tap on Julian's phone, I could hear the pop of a champagne cork. To the new kings of the sky, Julian shouted, his voice slurred with alcohol and arrogance. $50 billion in contracts. Sienna, we are going to be richer than God. I sat in the back of a nondescript surveillance van parked in a lot across the street from the main gate. The air inside was stale, smelling of ozone and cold coffee. Marcus sat next to me, his face illuminated by the blue glow of his laptop. He looked terrified, but his hands were steady. Are you ready? I asked. If I do this, there is no going back, Marcus whispered. There never was. I replied. Execute the death protocol. Marcus pressed the enter key. In the Thorn Aerospace Tower, the celebration ended instantly. On every screen in the control room, the diagnostic lights turned from green to a dead, unyielding black. The administrative access was severed. The central computer locked down, isolating the flight control software behind a wall of encryption that only I possessed the key to. What is happening? Julian's voice crackled through our audio feed. Why did the screens go dark? I cannot access the pre-flight checklist. He frantically dialed my number. My phone buzzed on the dashboard of the van. I watched the name Julian flash on the screen, illuminating the dark interior. I did not touch it. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. She is not answering. Julian screamed, "Get security. Go to her apartment. Drag her here by her hair if you have to." We listened as the head of security radioed back 10 minutes later. They had kicked down the door of my studio apartment, but all they found was an empty room and a set of keys left on the counter. I was a ghost. Back in the office, panic was setting in. Without the system unlock, the plane was a billion-dollar paperweight. The investors were already arriving at their hotels. Canceling the flight now would destroy the company's stock price. We do not need the main system. Sienna's voice cut through the chaos, shrill and desperate. Use the developer override, the manual boot sequence. I looked at Marcus. His eyes went wide. "That is suicide," Marcus whispered to me. "The manual boot bypasses the thermal limiters. If they run the engine like that, the sensors will not trip even if the core is melting." "I know," I said, my eyes fixed on the screen. "Let's see if he is stupid enough to do it." "But the warning lights," Julian stammered on the audio feed. "The screen says catastrophic failure imminent. If we bypass, it is just a glitch," Julian Sienna yelled. "Do you want to lose everything? Do you want to be poor? Sign the override order. Force the mechanics to start the engines manually." There was a long silence. I could hear Julian's heavy breathing. He was cornered. On one side was safety and bankruptcy. On the other was a gamble with human lives that promised billions. "Bring me the clipboard," Julian said, his voice trembling. Through the hacked security camera, I watched Julian take the red pen. The override order clearly stated in bold text that the signatory assumed full criminal liability for bypassing safety protocols. He stared at the paper. Then, driven by greed and fear, he scribbled his signature. "It is done," I whispered, saving the video file and the digital copy of the signed order. He had just signed his own confession. He had authorized a flight he knew was unsafe, and I had the proof in high definition. The morning of the test flight was blindingly bright. The tarmac was a sea of media vans and satellite trucks, with over 300 reporters jostling for the best angle. In the center of it all, the Phoenix X gleamed like a silver bullet, its engines humming with a low, menacing growl. It looked magnificent, but I knew that under that glossy paint job, the metal was screaming under the stress. Julian stood on a raised platform draped in velvet, looking like a king addressing his subjects. He wore a suit that probably cost $10,000, his smile wide and practiced. Sienna stood beside him, clutching a glass of champagne, posing for the cameras. "Today, we do not just launch a plane," Julian bellowed into the microphone, his voice booming over the loudspeakers. "We launch a legacy. My father dreamed of this day. And I have delivered it. The Phoenix X is the safest, most advanced machine ever built by human hands." The crowd erupted in polite applause. The pilot in the cockpit gave the thumbs up. The engines began to spool up, a high-pitched whine that vibrated in the chests of everyone present. Then, the world turned into chaos. From the service entrance, a convoy of 6 black federal SUVs tore onto the runway, their sirens wailing and lights flashing blue and red. They did not stop at the perimeter. They drove straight onto the active tarmac, swerving directly in front of the taxiing jet, forcing the pilot to slam on the brakes. The nose gear screeched, and the massive plane lurched to a halt. Julian froze on the podium. His mouth hung open. Beside him, Sienna's hands shook so violently that her crystal flute slipped from her fingers, shattering on the stage floor. The door of the lead SUV flew open. I stepped out, flanked by 4 FBI agents in windbreakers and the grim-faced director of the FAA. I held a thick, leather-bound binder in my hand. The cameras swung instantly from the plane to me. What is the meaning of this?" Julian shouted into the microphone, his voice cracking. "Get off my runway. You are trespassing." I walked up the steps of the platform, the agents right behind me. I snatched the microphone from his hand. "Cut the engines," I ordered the pilot, my voice echoing across the silent airfield. The turbines whined down into silence. I turned to the cameras, holding up the binder. "My name is Elena Vance," I said, my voice steady and cold. "And I am halting this flight because the engines on that plane are stolen property. The intellectual property rights for the Phoenix propulsion system belong to the Vance Trust. Julian Thorne has no legal right to use them." A gasp went through the crowd. Julian lunged at me, but an agent shoved him back. "She is lying!" Julian screamed, his face pale. She is just a disgruntled employee. I am the owner," I retorted, locking eyes with him. "But theft is the least of your problems. Julian, you are not just a thief. You are a murderer in the making." I turned back to the press. Thorne Aerospace replaced the aviation-grade titanium in the fuselage with a cheap aluminum alloy to save money for their marketing budget. I announced, "That plane is not a flagship. It is a flying coffin!" Sienna shrieked. "That is slander arrest her," I signaled to the FAA inspection team. Two mechanics with heavy tools ran to the left engine of the Phoenix X. In front of the live news feeds, they unlatched the cowling and pried back the outer panel. Underneath the glossy white paint, the metal was webbed with dark, jagged lines. "Zoom in." I commanded the camera crews. "Those are microfractures. Sienna Croft ordered them painted over yesterday. If that plane had taken off, the engine would have disintegrated within 20 minutes. The crowd turned feral. The investors in the front row began to shout and boo. Behind Julian, the giant digital board displaying the company stock price began to flash red. The numbers tumbled. Within seconds, the stock plummeted 40%, then 60%, wiping out billions of dollars of value in a heartbeat. Julian looked at the screen, then at the plane, and finally at me. He looked small. I did not know," Julian whimpered, backing away. "Sienna told me it was safe. She told me—" "You signed the flight order, Julian," I said softly, just for him to hear. "I have your signature." The lead FBI agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of metal handcuffs from his belt. "Julian Thorne, Sienna Croft," the agent announced, his voice cutting through the noise. "You are under arrest for corporate fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and reckless endangerment of human life." The click of the handcuffs snapping onto Julian's wrists was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. Sienna began to wail as she was dragged away, her heels scraping against the asphalt. Julian slumped, his head hanging low, as the empire his father built crumbled into dust around him. The chaos on the runway was a symphony of justice. Julian Thorne, the man who had once looked down on me from the comfort of his leather executive chair, was now being shoved against the hood of a federal vehicle. His pristine suit was wrinkled, and his face was twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He was not acting like a CEO anymore. He was acting like a frightened child caught stealing from the jar. "It was her," Julian screamed, thrashing against the grip of the agents, jerking his head toward Sienna. "She lied to me. She told me the engineering reports were clean. I am a victim here. I demand to speak to my lawyer." A few feet away, Sienna was in an even worse state. The glamorous influencer who had mocked my clothes and forced me to clean her boots was gone. In her place was a sobbing wreck. Her mascara had run down her cheeks in thick, black streaks, ruining her complexion. She reached out toward Julian with handcuffed hands, desperate for a savior who did not exist. "Julian, please," Sienna wailed, her voice cracking. Tell them I just handled the marketing. I do not know anything about engines." "You promised you would protect me." Julian stopped struggling for a second. He looked at her with eyes full of venom. He did not offer comfort. He leaned forward and spat directly at her feet. "You useless parasite," Julian hissed. "You ruined everything." I walked slowly toward them. The asphalt radiated heat, but I felt cool, calm, and utterly vindicated. When Julian saw me, his expression shifted from anger to a pathetic desperation. He stopped fighting the agents and slumped against the car. "Elena," Julian gasped, his eyes darting between me and the agents. "Elena, tell them I would never hurt anyone intentionally. My father. Think of my father. You loved him. He trusted you. For his sake, please, drop the charges." "Do not let them destroy his name." I stopped inches from him. I looked him dead in the eye. I felt no pity, only a deep, resounding hollow where my respect for him used to be. "It is exactly because of your father that I stopped that plane. Julian," I said, my voice low and hard, "if I had let you launch that death trap today, 60 people would have burned to death on this runway. Your father's legacy would have been that of a mass murderer. I did not destroy his name. I saved it from you." Julian's knees buckled. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He finally understood that his greed and his ego were the architects of his own destruction. He let out a low, guttural sound, a moan of absolute defeat. I turned to the lead FBI agent. I pulled a small silver flash drive from my pocket. "Officer," I said, "this drive contains a voice recording of Sienna Croft admitting to bribing the safety inspector. It also contains the high-definition video file of Julian Thorne signing the flight override order despite seeing the red warning flags. It proves premeditated negligence." The agent took the drive and nodded. He signaled his team. "Get them out of here," the agent ordered. Julian was dragged into the back of the SUV, his head hanging so low his chin touched his chest. Sienna was shoved into the second vehicle, still sobbing. As the convoy drove away, a team of federal auditors began placing yellow police tape around the landing gear of the Phoenix X. I watched as another team marched toward the hangar to seize the corporate assets. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Marcus. Behind him stood the 20 engineers and mechanics I had worked with for a decade. They looked tired, but their eyes were shining. "You did it, Elena," Marcus said softly. "You actually did it." I looked up at the towering hangar. A crew of workers was already up on a crane, dismantling the massive gold letters of the Thorne Aerospace logo. The T was already gone, leaving a ghost of an outline on the metal siding. "It is over," I whispered. The weight that had been crushing my chest for months finally lifted. I took a deep breath of the kerosene-scented air. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. The caller ID displayed a number from Washington, D.C. "This is Elena Vance," I answered. "Ms. Vance." A deep, authoritative voice spoke on the other end. "This is the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition. We just saw the news. We are canceling the contract with Thorne Aerospace effective immediately. However, we still need that plane. We would like to discuss a direct contract with your new entity to develop the True Phoenix project. When can you be in D.C.? I looked at the empty runway, then at the open sky. "I can be there tomorrow morning," I said. The wheels of justice usually turn slowly, but when you grease them with a high-definition video confession and a mountain of forensic data, they spin as fast as a jet turbine. Just 1 month after the fiasco on the runway, the trial of the century came to a thunderous close. The evidence was absolute. There were no plea deals, no wiggling out on technicalities, and no mercy from a judge who looked at the endangered passenger list and saw his own family there. I sat in the front row of the gallery, wearing a suit wide enough to blind the cameras. Julian stood before the bench, looking like a man whose soul had been scooped out. When the gavel banged, it sounded like a gunshot. "Julian Thorne," the judge announced, his voice booming through the silent courtroom, "for multiple counts of corporate fraud, grand larceny, and reckless endangerment, I sentence you to 15 years in a federal penitentiary." Julian did not scream. He simply collapsed into his chair. Sienna fared no better. She received 8 years for her role in the bribery scheme and conspiracy. As the bailiffs led them away, Julian looked back one last time. He did not look at his lawyers or his weeping mother. He looked at me. I did not smile. I simply nodded, a final acknowledgement that the balance sheet was now balanced. With the leadership in prison and the stock value annihilated, Thorn Aerospace went into immediate liquidation. The banks wanted to salvage whatever they could from the wreckage. They needed a buyer who understood the infrastructure, someone who could turn the lights back on immediately. There was only one person on Earth qualified for the job. I bought the entire company, the tower, the hangars, the patents, and the remaining inventory for pennies on the dollar. I used the substantial settlement money from my wrongful termination lawsuit and the advance from the new Department of Defense contract to seal the deal. The first thing I did was rip the neon signs off the building. The next day, a modest, brushed steel sign went up Vance Aviation, but inside the lobby, I made sure one thing remained. I rehung the oil painting of Thomas Thorne. He was a good man who raised a bad son, and I wanted his spirit to know that his dream was safe again. I spent the next week making phone calls. I contacted every single engineer, mechanic, and janitor that Julian and Sienna had fired to cut costs. "We are reopening," I told them, "and everyone gets a 10% raise and full retroactive benefits." They came back in droves. The hallways that had been silent were suddenly filled with the noise of work and laughter. I also established the Maria Vance Foundation. It was a scholarship fund named after my mother, dedicated to paying the full tuition for young women from low-income families who wanted to study aerospace engineering. My mother never got to see me win, but now her name would lift thousands of others into the sky. On my first official day as owner, I walked into the executive suite. Marcus was waiting for me, holding a tablet. He looked nervous. "So," Marcus said, shifting his weight, Do I go back to the server room?" "No," I replied, tossing him a set of keys to the office next to mine. "You are the new vice president of operations. Marcus, I need someone I can trust to watch the blind spots." He stared at the keys, his eyes watering. Thank you. Elena, I won't let you down." I walked into my office. It was no longer a studio for handbags. It was a command center. I sat behind the heavy oak desk and swiveled the chair to face the floor-to-ceiling window. Down below, on the runway, the first corrected prototype of the Phoenix was taxiing for takeoff. This time, the titanium was pure. The brakes were solid. The pilot was safe. I watched as the plane roared down the tarmac and lifted effortlessly into the deep blue Seattle sky. It soared higher and higher, a silver streak of perfection. I realized then that true revenge is not about destroying your enemy. It is about outliving them, outworking them, and proving that integrity is the only currency that matters in the long run. I did not need to scream or fight. I just needed to be better. I picked up my mug, the warmth of the ceramic seeping into my hands. I took a slow, deliberate sip of black coffee and smiled at the horizon. "This is how a woman runs a business," I whispered to the empty room. "Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on Elena's journey. If you enjoyed this tale of justice and redemption, please subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and smash that hype button to help this story reach even more people.